Hello, everybody. So, hope everybody had a good weekend. Got a couple things to go over this evening. Uh, oh, more people coming in. So thus far, we've kind of started looking at the syntax for the language we'll be using, C#, and to practice that, we looked at the user interface panel and or the UI panel in Unity, because we're going to want UI panels in our games at some point. Those are useful things to have. Also took a look last week at 3D modeling software, which really comes down to basically a connect the dots sort of image construction. We place dots around in three-dimensional space. That's our vertexes. And then a computer connects all the dots and fills in shapes with faces. And we keep adding and removing and adjusting those dots until we get the shape we want. Still some more stuff to look at there, because with 3D modeling, there's lighting and the direction the light comes from and all sorts of other things to take into account. So we can't just put a color on it like we do in 2D. We have to actually define a material, like how smooth or rough is the surface, how shiny or dull is the surface, and all the characteristics of the material. We'll look at that, and also some texturing, because we probably don't want perfectly smooth surfaces on our models. That's not very realistic, but we'll come back and look at that a few times throughout the semester. That was part of the assignments this week, was just to kind of start into modeling. I put on something that hopefully isn't too difficult. As for a canoe shape, which hopefully isn't too difficult, a canoe and an oar. And then if we needed like 2 oars for a canoe, that's just a copy and paste from the one thing. So hopefully a simple shape, but also this isn't an art class, so there's not a quality requirement on there. Really, I just want you to start working with that, because it does take a bit of practice. But there's some other stuff we need to look at as far as game development. So some notes to start into here, and then if time allows, we might get started into the first bit of math type things we're going to need. Just talk a little bit about vectors in the part we'll need. But first off, just some other notes for a key point about game development. Before we get started into this, does anybody have any questions about the stuff we've seen so far? This should probably be addressed first. Okay, I guess, something in the chat room. You just need the shape for now, but if you've had 3D experience before and want to practice more, feel free. More is always acceptable in my class. The assignments as they're written out is sort of the baseline. So if you want to do more, I'm always okay with that, because more practice is good. But the main thing is I just wanted to make sure everybody got started practicing that. Because again, this course is more focused on the programming side, but unlike traditional, say, desktop software development or mobile app development, we can't separate the front end and back end like we do there. Game development, they're too intertwined. So even if we're focusing all our efforts on being a back end programmer for game development, we still need to have working knowledge of the front end graphics sort of stuff, because they're just too intertwined for game development. But if you've had practice with 3D modeling and stuff and want to take it further, more is always acceptable. Oh, the sun's coming out. I better close the curtain real quick. We will be looking at some basic texturing. Obviously, there's a lot there, easy to get lost in, but we'll look at like the starting points on that. We'll come back and look at that a few times, but again, it takes practice. So the point of that was just to start getting practice. So, any other questions? Okay, I assume silence means no questions. So these lecture notes I titled, "What are we doing here?" Right? What is it we are doing here? And what we're really doing, the name of this course is Advanced Simulation and Game Development. Keep saying game development, but simulation is very related. We use the same tools, the same ideas for working with, say, engineers developing a new product as we do developing a game. We just approach it a little bit differently. In either case, what we're doing here is we're telling a story, really. So that's the first set of notes for this evening, is some stuff about storytelling. And I threw together these notes, so I guess a good introduction to this is obviously not a new concept to humanity, right? What's new is storytelling with a video game. And people who study language have been studying storytelling for a long time. And after I put these notes together, I ran into the person who teaches creative writing at the Ivy Tech Sellersburg campus. And I was like, oh, I just put some lecture notes together for storytelling for the game dev class. Do you have some good notes? And she was kind enough to share with us her notes, which is, that was part of her focus in her master's degree. So after we go through these notes I put together, we'll also look at her notes, because we don't need to start from scratch, right? Obviously, there's some differences, because she put her notes together intending to sit there at a keyboard and write out the words for storytelling, a traditional format for it. But there's a lot of similarities in how we approach these things. And people who study language have already been studying that for a long time. So we don't need to start from scratch in order to tell a story. We just have a different medium to present the story in. First thing, I want to start with rule number 1. I'm going to call it that. Let's start with rule number 1. So when I took a course that was like this, a game development course, that's what the textbook called it, rule number 1. I thought it was a really good one. I think I've told you all this story. The first time I created a game, I'm putting quote marks around that. First time I made a game, programmed a game, was in summer of 1982. I first learned to had my first formal instruction on programming in summer of 1988. They were trying to make summer school interesting, because it really was like somebody flipped a light switch and kids weren't allowed to stay at home by themselves anymore. And at that time, there weren't daycares where parents could drop their kids off, or places for the kids to go during the day. So they kept they kept the public schools open, at least where I lived, and tried to make it interesting. One of the things was our music teacher's husband was a programmer. So he came in and taught a bunch of us how to program. It was on old Apple II machines. We were using a flavor of BASIC. I don't think he ever said it at that time. Years later, I did realize, okay, we learned to program in BASIC. Then a few years later, around 1992, we weren't farming anymore, but still lived on a farm. And there wasn't much to do. I was about 14 years old by then. 1992, I was getting ready to turn 14. So I was about 13 years old, so couldn't go anywhere. It was a farming community. It was miles and miles to get anywhere. We weren't farming anymore, so there wasn't really anything to do on the farm, but we had a couple home computers. And that had, well, back then, just back in the mid 80s, basic computer usage was like programming. So I sat around and through trial and error, made a stick man dribble a basketball and throw, or yeah, simulated a stick man like dribbling a basketball and throwing it through a hoop. With a slight chance that it would miss, it would usually make it. I didn't know a whole lot about probability at the time, but that's what I considered my first game. Basically spent the whole summer with trial and error doing that. Way before the days of Google and being able to look it up. I guess the internet technically existed, but I certainly hadn't heard of it at that point. That was a long drawn out process. And then later when I came back to school to get paperwork and computers, because I learned how to program when I was 9 years old. When I was changing careers around the age of 32, 33, I didn't have any paperwork that would qualify me that would get my foot in the door for a computer sort of job. So that's what brought me back to school. And one of the classes I took was game development class, and the textbook referred to this as rule number 1. And I really liked it. I always try to keep this in mind, so I wanted to start with this. The game must be player versus game, and never, whoops, that's not how it's spelled, never, and never player versus programmer. This one I really like, because most people that start thinking about game development and want to get into it do so because probably gamers, right? I believe that's already shown up in this class, right? Those in our introduction discussion board and stuff. Pretty sure everybody mentioned the games they like to play. That's what gets people in here. So we all have that competitive nature, right? That led to us being a gamer, but you aren't the player's opponent. You, as the programmer, the game developer, you're on the player's side. You want the player, you have to want the player to win. But you don't want to hand them the victory because that's boring, right? You want to make it challenging enough that they have to work for it so they really feel like it was an accomplishment. But as a programmer, you would have an unfair advantage. Games that would be player versus programmer would only be fun at most one time. And probably not even fun one time for the most part. So you always have to make sure you're on the player side. In the game, you're looking for that level of challenge, that appropriate level of challenge where it's hard enough to make it fun so that it feels like an accomplishment and they enjoy what they're doing. You don't want to make it too easy because then it's boring. And winning the game doesn't really feel like an accomplishment. But you don't want to make it too hard either, where it's almost impossible. So that's something to keep in mind. And I wanted to start our content for this course with that. I'm going to call it Rule 1, and a whole lot of the things we say content-wise this semester, I'm going to relate back to rule number 1. Remember, we are on the player's side. We're trying to make it challenging for the player, but not impossible for the player. So we always want to keep that in mind. So now to the storytelling content. So the name of this course, Advanced Simulation and Game Development. There's 2 parts there. We're always talking about the game development. Rule number 1 is directly relating to games. We certainly wouldn't want to stop an engineer from testing their new design, right? Like we would with a game. So there's some differences there, but for that first part, simulation, we want to be able to emulate a physical environment for some sort of experimental purpose. For example, what I wrote here is a virtual version of a new design for a suspension system for a car. That we can do testing on it before spending large amounts of money to actually make that suspension system and do physical testing. we can set it up as a mathematical model in a computer and do lots of testing and get some refinements done before we go spend a fortune on the first version. Get some, I guess you could think of it as pre-testing. Pre-testing so that we don't have a lot of wastefulness in the first couple drafts of the real versions. The second part of that name, I'll put a definition as entertainment through immersion into an emulated environment. For example, a common example is The Legend of Zelda Saga, taking place in the world of Hyrule, which generally follows the same laws of physics as ours. They have some time travel and some magic involved, but in general, it has the same laws of physics, right? If we drop something, it falls down. If Link jumps off a cliff, he goes down, not up. So generally the same laws of physics as our world. So that's where the math stuff's going to come in, because the main two uses of this, we want to keep physics in mind for both simulations and game developments. So we want to keep those things in mind, and physics is the mathematical description of reality, of our universe, which sometimes doesn't seem like it, especially when people will start talking about quantum mechanics and stuff. And I've had to correct a couple people lately when they say something about quantum mechanics or some of the real advanced stuff, but especially quantum mechanics. It's like, that wasn't something people thought, this might be a neat idea. Quantum mechanics was where people went out, took actual measurements in the world, and then wrote a math equation that explained those equations. So when we try to put words on that, we end up with things that are very, very wrong. They seem like nonsense when we say them out loud, or they completely fall apart in English. But the math equations are based on real world measurements, and it has never failed a prediction yet. Actually, a whole lot of our modern technology is based on things from quantum mechanics that don't make a lick of sense when we say them in English, but our technology is based on it. So things on like an airplane, we're willing to risk lives over those math equations being correct. But it seems very, very strange when we go and start talking about them. So physics is a mathematical thing. We're going to look at Newtonian physics. That's more of some plug and chug formulas, sort of thing computers are great for. So got some math things in common. But other than the physics, what is it these things have in common? And that's that they're both telling a story. For the simulation example there that I just mentioned, it's the story of how a suspension system holds up over 100,000 miles of use. See the word prototype popped up in the chat room. So yeah, we build a virtual prototype, because building a physical prototype would cost a fortune. And if we don't have all the kinks worked out, when we spend that fortune, we're going to have to spend that fortune again and again and again as we work it out. So it's a very important thing for engineering, and it uses the same tools that we'll use for game development. Or in the other example, that one's a lot more obvious. It's the story of good versus evil in the kingdom of Hyrule across the ages. I'm assuming everybody is familiar with Zelda or Legend of Zelda games. That one seems like it's okay to just refer to it. So that's what we're going to start with. So stuff about storytelling. We're not writing a novel or even a short story, right? We're not sitting there and typing up English words to tell the story, or sitting around a campfire reciting the story, or doing like an opera and singing the story. Video games have allowed us a new method of telling stories to immerse people in the game. Use some different tactics, but a lot of the general concepts for telling a story is still going to be similar. we'll want to have some sort of synopsis of the story you want to tell. Ready by the time your proposal is due, which I think is module 3. We'll get to module 3 on Wednesday, and we'll talk about the proposal and stuff Wednesday night. But you're going to want to have some sort of synopsis of the story you want to use a video game to tell. What's going on there? I guess the first tie-in with storytelling rule number 1 is if the player is not able to finish your game, then they're not going to hear the story you want to tell them. So yeah, a lot of stuff this semester is going to tie into that rule. That's a basic one because, well, most people that come into this field are gamers, so have that competitive edge. But remember, the player is not your opponent. You're on the player's side. So as we jump into this, since you all have made it this far in life, I'm going to assume you're familiar with the basic tenets of telling a story. Obviously, there's a lot that could go into this, right? That's something you must do. It's okay if I go ahead and erase this. That's rule number 1. I'm going to say it over and over and over again. So that's the starting point we want to keep in mind for everything we do. Oh, and for those who haven't had me in class before, I do try to ask that every time before I erase the board. I remember sitting in many classes trying to keep up on notes, and then suddenly the board would get erased. Chalk. Oh, y'all hear that? Last time I ordered chalk, they sent it without a box. There's the big handfuls of chalk into an envelope. Like that's not a good way to ship chalk. Some pieces seem to make it through, but way more of them broke than did not. Okay, so back to the storytelling. A broad view, just the general idea here. The thing you're familiar with from Hollywood is probably that 3-act version, right? This is the basic 3-act story, and that's a good spot to start with. Because what I have in mind for these notes, sometimes when we go to tell a story, we can barely stop that story from coming out, right? It's inside us wanting to explode out, and we can, and it's trying to come out faster than we can tell it. This isn't for those times, because that's easy. This is for the other times when you're approaching it like a job. It's like, oh, I got a story to tell, and I've got to force something out, and nothing seems to be falling into place. So I put together a few tips for that, is really what I did here. Because obviously, if the story's flowing out on its own, you don't want to interrupt. You want to let it come out the way it's going to come out. But just a few tips here. So the basic 3-act version. So first off, we want to introduce our characters. Try to write neatly here. Introduce our characters. And maybe the setting. And then for our second act, for the first summary here, I'm just going to write plot thickens. I'm going to add some more stuff about that. And then the third act, well, there's really 2 main paths that we take. And that's either going to be resolution or absolution. Which the actual definition for resolution, that is quality of being determined. That's what we get out of the dictionary for that. Determined. Absolution, the other main way to wrap up a story, is formal release from guilt or obligation. resolution is where we have that nice end of the story. It can't go any further, right? Like at the end of the original Star Wars movie, well, number 4, the first Star Wars to come out, everything was resolved at the end when the Death Star exploded, because that was what the story was about. The evil empire had this powerful new weapon that was, the entire galaxy was in danger from it. So when the rebels were able to destroy it, the story was determined. The galaxy was no longer in threat, so it was ended. More often than not in Hollywood, we get absolution. That's like the Die Hard movies. It doesn't matter how many people Bruce Willis killed along the way, or how many buildings he blew up, or how many buildings, planes, how many explode. Doesn't matter how many people he hurt along the way, or how much destruction was involved. In the end, Bruce Willis stopped the bad guys, so he's released from guilt. Right? The story goes on because obviously there was just one bad guy in that situation. Could easily be more to that story to tell, but it kind of wrapped up nicely. All the actions were justified in the end by that claim, but I guess that statement right there itself would be a long discussion in an ethics course, as far as whether there's really absolution or not. The whole, does the end justify the means? That's our 2 primary ways of wrapping up a story. So we introduce things, create some sort of sticky situation to make it interesting, to make something interesting for these things we just introduced, and then we wrap it up. So our 3-act version. So act 1 is what's going on and who's involved. Then we get over to act 2. Is the main part of the story. What I wrote here to summarize it was step it up a notch. And by it, that's referring to the answer to this "what's going on" question. Step it up a notch and make stakes dire. Make the stakes dire. So make whatever this situation is a lot more meaningful, a lot more important. So obviously in video game, most of our stuff happens here, right? We have a cut scene at the beginning to introduce our characters. Maybe a small, simple thing to run around so the player can get used to the controls and figure out how their character moves and things like that. Or in a role-playing game, walk through a town and do some shopping and get used to the controls and buy some weapons and armor to get the game started. But then almost the entire video game's an Act 2 situation. In movies, they would be more evenly distributed as far as a long introduction to make you care about the characters. And then the situation gets about as much, the dire straits get about as much time as introducing those characters. I don't remember how it was. Oh yeah. Then Act 3, I didn't leave my trim there, but what I wrote to summarize that is, for better or worse, wrap it up quickly. in general, when you're telling a story, unless you're doing something artistic, trying to make an artistic statement, everybody knows the hero is going to win, right? So we don't need to drag out the hero's victory any more than it is interesting to do so. So that's our general format for a story. The big sections in the fill in the blank when there's not a story just naturally falling out on its own. What's going on and who's involved with it. Just amp everything up. Make whatever that situation is much more important and meaningful. Which in a video game, that's going to act 2 is going to be pretty much the entire video game. Then act 3, no matter how it's going to end, wrap it up quickly. Now that you have the characters, the dire straits you put them into, resolve that. And either resolve or absolve that. Both ways are adequate ways to wrap up a story. And usually the story will obviously lend itself to one or the other. Is there a deterministic end? Is that clearly the end of the story, or do we need to just make it look like everything we went through was worth it to get that result? So some thoughts to keep in mind there. Let's see, the note about her English, like the notes from the English teacher that teach Jamie Eblin. If anybody around the Sellersburg campus has had her, she teaches creative writing, which I believe was part of her master's. It was 6 or 7 years ago when she told me, but I think it was poetry and creative writing. So this is what she did her graduate work in. So when I saw her not long after putting these notes together, I was like, hey, I'm getting ready to teach storytelling and game development class. Do you have some tips? And she's like, yeah, I'll share with you the notes. And like I said earlier, we don't need to start from scratch from storytelling. We can take what linguistics people have already learned. I'm drawing a blank on the word. It starts with a T, the language people. I can't think of the word right now, but linguistics people, they've been studying storytelling for a long time. So we can use their knowledge as a jumping off point. So she shared with me the lecture notes that she uses when she goes in there for the creative writing class and explains to people the steps for creating a story. So the things we want to talk about, terminology really, and what it means. So obviously plot, and y'all are familiar with that story. It's like, what is the main event? What is going on? What's the conflict? What's the climax? How is the climax going to differ for the introduction? Obviously, crises make much more interesting stories, and crises and climax, those things are going to relate directly over to telling a story with graphics and sound effects and lighting and color choices and all the stuff, the tools we have at hand to tell a story rather than the traditional type up the English sentences. But that core concept is still applies. The rising, that's, I guess, a more technically appropriate way to describe the Act 1 thing. Introduce our characters, place them into this setting, and build up to the climax or crisis, everything that leads up to it. Then the falling action, the stuff at the end, how is the conflict resolved? And what is the driver for your story? Is it entirely based off that plot? Things like that. And then the last sentence she had here, I really like this. This would be an important one for game developers. We want to be careful not to have a then this happened, then this happened, then this happened feel. Like the early days of game development, they kind of had to do that, right? Like the original Super Mario Brothers, they came out with the Nintendo Entertainment System. They were doing everything from scratch. Right? They didn't have a game engine to work with. They had to sit down and write their game engine and the game at the same time. So it very much came out as a just level 1, level 2, level 3, right in order. But by the time we got to, say, Super Mario 3, there were options. We didn't have to go through the game in a particular order. And the overall story was still the same, even if the order changed around. But a tip for writers, but it would definitely still apply to telling a story with games. Narration point of view, that's going to be very important for us, right? We even use the same term. First, second person, third person's probably going to be like the we could think of it differently. Obviously, the FPS, I'll say it that way, because I think hopefully everybody knows what that means and which word I am intentionally trying to avoid in a school setting. But the FPS style games, where the character's eyes are like our own, we can only be in that character looking forward. Do we have a broader perspective, like a platform game? Kind of like, or a team effort? Are we just a person on the team, or get somewhat of a broader perspective? Or do we get the entire worldview? Are we like an outsider looking down on this world, like an overhead map sort of thing, right? And this is the big question. So which way are you going to do it? But then you want to make sure you justify why that is a great way to tell this story every time. And that's what our discussion boards are about, right? I provided some simple plots to get you started, and you answer questions like this. Is first person or overhead world better for, well, in the case of the first discussion board, that farming game? I saw both answers and great responses to both of them, great versions for both of them, and you all addressed that question very nicely. Why is that the appropriate one for the game? So we keep things like that in mind. And for that overhead of the world, how broad is your view? Going back to the original Legend of Zelda game, that's a very popular game, has been for a long time, enough so that I hope even the people that were born many years after that was released have at least played some of the scenes in the original one, see what the start to it was. But there were things like when we had the overhead maps, we'd see more than we would in a first person view. Kind of saw what was around it, but not everything. If there was a secret passageway that we had to burn a bush to get into, we couldn't tell that bush apart from every other bush in the area. Or in some of the dungeons, there were walls that were weaker than other walls, I guess, and put a bomb against them, and that would blow a new hole in the doorway. But from the player perspective, even though we got that wider view of the world, we couldn't tell by looking that was a weaker spot in the wall where we could stick one of the little bomb things and make a new doorway or find a secret passageway. We had to actually, at very first, I remember playing Zelda when it was a brand new game, and way before the days of the internet. So finding tips and stuff and maps, that involved going and buying a magazine, and going and buying a magazine was sort of a hard thing to do for a 10-year-olds, or like I was about, Nintendo Power Magazine wasn't the cheapest magazine. So me and my brother were 10 and 11. I was 10, so he was either 11 or 12. So we didn't have money to buy a magazine. We had to get our parents to buy us a magazine. And get it to happen on a special trip to the store, which when Legends of Zelda came out, Nintendo Power was sold out every time we went to the store for a while. So it was hard to get that thing. So we'd have to like randomly discover which one of the bombs blew a hole in the wall. And then we then spend a whole bunch of time going around looking to see where we could knock holes in the wall and find secret passages until we got the map. So that level can help make the games a lot of fun stuff. And that's the questions here. How does that affect the rest of your narration? How does it affect the other elements, right? If you have a first person view of the game, you have a very different perspective on the NPCs, non-playable characters. I need to spell that out every time. The non-playable characters, the side characters that aren't enemies, the ones that help you along the way. A first-person game has a very different perspective on them than an overhead game, right? If we have the whole view of the village when we get there, we can see all the NPCs standing around. But if we're in a first-person view, we have to actually navigate around the village and find them. So it affects how the story is told and helps to bring your user in. Mood, obviously, that's a very important one. What are you trying to convey in the story? And we can, with game development, we have a big edge over the people who are writing short stories and novels, because we don't have to do it through adjectives and adverbs and language choice. We can actually use dark and light colors and music, dark coloring, dark shading in our world with ominous music versus very bright colors with sort of the happy, popcorny, bouncing along sort of music. We have other tools to directly affect that. So mood is a big one for us. And you can see the questions here. I'm going to download this as a PDF and give it to you all here in just a few minutes. That's why I'm kind of skimming through it, not reading every point, because they're good points to think about. And this was courtesy of Jamie Evelyn, a professor at Ivy Tech Sellersburg. She teaches English and she's teaching creative writing this semester. So it's her lecture notes from that is what this one is. Obviously characters, that's pretty straightforward. Who are the main characters? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Which ones are playable? Which ones are not playable? And when we have the playable characters, how do we defeat the bad guys? Unless you want to turn your story around and do an artistic sort of thing where you're clearly the bad guy and you're trying to beat the good guys by any stretch of how we explain ethics. Those games are fun too and quite popular. So every story is going to be a little bit different. Here's the big question: what motivates the characters to act? You know what motivates you to act. Right? You're the player in the character in the game. You're the one trying to work your way through the story. But what motivates the NPCs and the mobs to do what they do? Complex characters that matter to your audience. That makes a difference. What was the show? That comedy. Big Bang Theory. That comedy. There was a quote in there that was really nice about this. They presented it as a rude joke. Everything in that joke. Those people were so mean to each other. But a quote from that show related to, I guess somebody had made a Lego video or something, and they commented, it's not enough to make the Legos move. You have to make the audience love the Legos. So you have to make, and the same thing applies to us in game development. You want your player to care about the NPCs. When a bunch of mobs raid a village and carry off your favorite NPC, you want your player to be motivated and stay up all night trying to rescue them and catch their interest, all that stuff. Dialogue, that one would translate more into like the playability and the interaction and stuff. There's some good points there, but when we translate from an English class to game dev class, dialogue would probably get pushed aside. The setting, that's kind of obvious. Where does it take place? How does the time period and place affect other choices? It's an important question to ask because sometimes we need to stay completely accurate, but that's not a total restriction, right? If we were doing something with, say, medieval knights in some kingdom, if we put in things like a flamethrower or a chainsaw, that's just for comedic effect, basically. But comedic effect is important in a story. So depending on our story, we might want things like that. I remember it was back in the days of PlayStation 1. I think the game was called Worms. It was this little slow moving strategy thing. You'd set up different teams and your worms had this little environment, and different colored worms were basically at war with each other, a big strategy thing. And there were a lot of weapons like strings that you could swing back and forth across gaps so you didn't fall into holes, or little sticks of dynamite, small guns, push each other. But then there were some just other purely comedic ones. So there was like nuclear weapons, which would destroy half your world. There might be one or two worms left, but then after you unlocked all the secrets, one of the, like the final weapon was Armageddon. When you released that, it like meteors came down from the sky and destroyed everything. Like there wasn't even a speck of dirt left or a single character left on the game. Obviously not a sensible weapon for like winning a war, but it had great comedic effect. So everybody was always excited when we would sit around playing that, hoping they would be the one that it first unleashed, that first got to use it, because you had to wait a certain amount of time as the game progressed further and further and further. The bigger weapons would get unlocked. But comedic effect is a good thing, so you don't want to discard it. The setting and accuracy, you all can read through some of this stuff. Symbolism goes a long way towards these questions up here of these why questions, like making the why do the side characters matter to you? Why is the narration or point of view important? Why is the conflict happening? So symbolism goes a long way for that. And in video games, a very popular thing is puzzles, right? First one that springs to mind is like the original Resident Evil game. There was, after you went through the mansion the first time, I think this was still back in the days of PlayStation 1, to move on into the secret labs, there was a puzzle and you had to piece together things from like 4 or 5 different rooms in the mansion, and then finally read like a nameplate under a picture in the art gallery hall to finally put all the puzzle pieces together and figure out how to get to the next level. So very symbolic things in the puzzles can make a big difference. The themes, the repeated tendencies that keep everything flowing as a whole. Y'all can read through that. Fairly straightforward. You probably already knew what themes are. And the audience is just as important to us as it is to the English people, right? Rule number 1, sorry to erase from the board, but we are on the player's side. We want to make sure the player wins, but we don't want to hand them a victory, right? We don't want to make the game say you push the start button and the words "you win" pop up on the screen. That's kind of a boring game. We want to make the player work for the game so they feel that reward when they get to the end. But we're on the player's side, so we need to keep the player in mind. Who are we making the game for and all that stuff? Because we're going to make them differently, right? If we get hired to make some education games for, say, 5-year-olds, We're going to approach it very differently than if our friends are bored with their zombie games and the next big release is pushed back 2 or 3 months, so they want something to do in between then, right? Like, hey, you make games, doesn't have to be a great one. Can you make a zombie game to pass the 2 months till the next big blockbuster comes out? We would approach making those games very differently. Who's the audience? How difficult is it? And those sort of things. So those notes can be very useful. People who study languages have been studying storytelling for a very long time. So storytelling isn't new, but storytelling with a video game is new. And we definitely have a few advantages, especially when it comes to this one right here, or to these two right here. We can make it seem like we're looking out of the same eyes as our character versus a book where we have to imagine that. Or we can give that person that, we have to just imagine being able to see the whole world as we read the novel. We can actually see that whole world in front of us as we're playing our game. And mood, we have colors, we have art, and we have graphics and music to really set the mood instead of just words. So here's this PDF. I'm going to put it in the chat room. Whoops. Apparently it's not Command H on the Mac. Can't remember where the keyboard shortcut is on a Mac, but Command H. Oh yeah, that's right. Command H hides the window. So I'll add a file. Do any of you Mac users know what that is to get the chat room? It's Control H on a Windows machine, but apparently that's not how to get to the chat room from on the Mac.
The Zoom chat room?
Yes. On a Windows machine, I can push Control H, but that usually translates to Command H, which hides a window on a Mac. So that's definitely not it. But either way, there's a button to open it. So in the chat room, y'all should see a PDF of these tips from her. She was nice enough to share those with us. So some very useful things. Did you know what that is, Andrew? Is that what you started to unmute and say? Or was that somebody else?
That was me. I don't know off the top of my head. I was looking it up.
Okay. Yeah, Zoom does have that nice thing. It's like one of the nicest features on a Chromebook is if you, no matter what piece of software you're working with, if you push Control Dot, you get a list of all the keyboard shortcuts for the software you're in. But Zoom at least has a menu for it. You just have to kind of dig around for it.
It's Command Shift H.
Command Shift H. That probably would have been my third or fourth guess. So I would have looked it up. I would have quit guessing and looked it up before then. Okay, if I erase this part, the main up here on the board, back to my notes, was just that general thing Hollywood spits out, 3-act version of a story. What's going on and who's involved. Crank everything up a notch to make it more interesting. And for better or worse, wrap it up quickly. And hopefully you got that in your notes or took a screenshot. So the last thing that I wanted to do as far as these notes go, that was 650. So that's probably going to take about 25 minutes. And we've been at this for 55 minutes, so this might be a good stopping point to take a break. And then we'll get into the tips for storytelling, and depending on how time goes afterwards, maybe some math stuff. But the lead in for this, I guess, is some more into my background. I've tried many things in my life, been back and forth, and had a little bit of trouble settling in on something. One of the things I tried along the way was I wanted to be a novelist. So I did spend years waking up to an alarm and making sure I put 35 to 40 hours in every week writing novels. Somebody in Baltimore flipped the bill for him, printing, distribution, the agents, all that stuff. People don't buy from authors they haven't heard of. So really I guess my stuff filled shelf space nicely when the popular authors ran low. There's Books A Million and other bookstores before bookstores faded out. And in the end, yeah, the contracts were for 7 years, so they just kind of expired with very little fanfare. And in the end, I made $17.69 in royalties. Like, that's with a dot, $17.69 in royalties, which is more than zero. So, but not what I'd hoped writing novels would accomplish. So the next set of tips is what I came along with for those years that I spent writing novels. Ended up with 4 in stores and stuff, and an agent promoting them, but people don't buy from authors they haven't heard of. And getting people to hear your name the first time is the biggest step. So I didn't quite get that far, but I did pick up a lot of things along the way as far as writing stories. And this is another thing where game development comes in. So after 7 years, those contracts expired, and then I got the copyright back. The copyrights came back to me from that publishing company in Baltimore. And I've been reworking the stories, mostly sci-fi stories. It really wasn't even anything fancy. It's like sci-fi stories that were, the intention of them was to pass a couple afternoons, right? If you're bored on a Saturday afternoon reading the books, a book that would be better than nothing, I guess. Cheesy sci-fi stuff. But now that I got the copyrights back from those 4, and then many more, because when I tried to publish the 5th one, they said as soon as what was it? As soon as 50 copies of anything, any combination from the first 4, as soon as that hit 50 copies of sales, they would pick up the 5th. They would pick up the 5th. And they're like, yeah, we like the stories, but we haven't even sold 50 books from the first 4. I think at that point, the 4th one hadn't even sold a single copy, because I didn't buy a copy. I knew what the story said. But it just kind of, after 7 years, I got the copyrights back with little to no fanfare. And since then, those and other stories that I've written, I've been converting them to ebooks, where video games are an embedded portion of that. So the basic idea is like you read the drama part and then play the action part. Very time consuming. So that stretches out for years. But in general, from those years that I spent writing stories, that's where the next list of tips comes in. But as we get ready to move, there's probably a good pause point to take a break. That way we don't take a break in the middle of something. So does 10 minutes sound good to everybody? Or anybody?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Yep.
All right, so 6:59, we will get back to it at 7:09. I'm gonna go grab some coffee. I will see y'all in just a moment.